Hello, hi everyone, and welcome. Whether you're watching this webinar live online or you're watching its recording, my name is Adolfo Sanchez Cuadrado. I'm a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Granada here in Spain, and I will be chairing today's session. So before introducing today's webinar and speaker, let me give you a bit of context. The ARCUS Alliance is a multilateral alliance of 9 institutions in the tertiary level, which share academic, scientific, and cultural objectives, a common vision of the role of higher education and research, and mutual fields of interest. Today's webinar is part of the guest lecture series called 9 Months, 9 Universities, which is offered in the framework of the Plurilingual and Intercultural Hub of the Alliance. This hub, is one of the work groups of the Alliance, as I said, and it aims to promote plurilingualism within the 9 institutions and also to capitalize on students, researchers, and staff's competence in different languages. Also, it aims to foster their intercultural competence, one of the soft skills much needed for today's society. The lectures of this series focus on specific topics related to language and culture and target mainly graduate and postgraduate students, as well as early stage researchers and academic staff. The lectures are intended to generate awareness and appreciation for the topic of multilingualism, as well as an understanding of the many areas of our lives that are related to and influenced by language. So let me now introduce today's speaker, Professor Eileen Ni Kanekur. Eileen, hello.
Hello, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining this initiative and for sharing your time and expertise with us. Let me introduce you very briefly, and I'll give you the floor. So Dr. Kanekur works in the Center for Irish Language Research, Teaching and Testing at Maynooth University in Ireland. She has a special interest in teacher education, both pre-service, teacher training, and continuous professional development. Dr. Ni Kanekur has been involved in teaching, teacher training, and syllabus design across all levels of education system in Ireland and internationally. She has experience in the early childhood sector at the primary, secondary, and third level, undergraduate and postgraduate, as well as in the adult and community sector. Her PhD was in cross-linguistic pedagogy. Eileen is about to deliver the following seminar, Cross-Linguistic Mediation. Sorry, I lost here. So the webinar entitled Cross-Linguistic Mediation, a Sustainable Translanguaging Practice. And her talk will explore the challenges of embracing translanguaging practices in minority language and CLIL education settings. It will consider the tension between drawing on learners' full linguistic repertoire and safeguarding the vitality of minority languages such as Irish. So before giving the screen to Eileen, I would like to remind you that you can leave any comments or questions you may have in the comments box during the presentation, and I will pass them on to Eileen at the end. You can also leave questions at the end of the presentation for the Q&A section. So, well, Eileen, thank you very much again for sharing your time with us. And without further ado, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Adolfo, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. Thank you for the slide. So on this title slide, you can see that I have a photo of junk food and another photo of a more nutritious food offering. And this is to illustrate my title, Is There a More Nutritious Approach? Which refers to investigating a more sustainable or nutritious, if you like, method of translanguaging in CLIL and minority language education. This title, Is There a More Nutritious Approach?, begs the question, more nutritious than what? So therefore, a change is implied. The less nutritious junk food approach, describing a teaching practice as it is or as it was, and a more nutritious approach describing a change that teachers perceived as a result of a training intervention. So what is the more nutritious approach, and what is the context of the change? Well, I'm referring to research I did looking at whether cross-linguistic mediation, as described in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, could possibly function as a sustainable way or a nutritious way to implement translanguaging in Irish medium classrooms to address the challenges that teachers face regarding the role of English, which is perceived as the elephant in the classroom. And I'll explain why later on. The structure of the research was that I recruited 4 second-level teachers. So what kind of teachers were these? They're subject teachers, which means that they were teaching subjects such as art or business, accountancy, economics, or social studies in schools that teach exclusively through Irish to students for whom Irish is not the first language. So the interesting thing about this is the subjects are taught through a language which is not the mother tongue of the children, which makes it quite like CLIL, but all the school language is through Irish as well, which makes it an immersion setting. So the majority language, which is English, is mainly the home language of the students, and the minority language, Irish, is the language of the school and all of the teaching. So what happened in the research? Firstly, I conducted an individual long, in-depth interview with each teacher, where they were invited to explore their feelings and their attitudes towards English in the classroom, the challenges they perceive with the role of English, and other general challenges that they face specific to the immersion setting. I then designed training workshops which introduced teachers to the concepts of translanguaging and cross-linguistic mediation, concepts that they hadn't come across before. We discussed sample tasks, and we gave the teachers the opportunity to design their own tasks based on texts that they brought with them to the workshops. What kind of texts? Examples were a YouTube video for a geography lesson, a YouTube video in English, but the geography lesson was to be delivered through Irish. A YouTube video for the subject art. Again, the video was in English, but the class was going to be delivered in Irish. The same thing for business, and also we used a reading text, which was an exam question in accountancy for a state exam. For a higher level state exam. So after the workshops were designed, I piloted them and then delivered the first workshop. And then after the workshop, each teacher was invited to record an audio or video reflection on their feelings about English and about the training and general thoughts that occurred to them immediately after that first workshop. So I was trying to capture what their feelings and emotions were at that stage of the research. After that, the second workshop was delivered a few weeks later, and again, they recorded another reflection there and then about what do they feel now about English and English in the classroom and mediation and translanguaging and all the concepts we had discussed. About 2 months after that, I did the second interview, which is another long, in-depth interview with the teachers, where they reflected on what they had gained from the training and had anything change in their feelings since the first interview. And when they were a few months back in the classroom, they did a third recorded reflection based on whether they felt that there was any change in their practice or how the training was affecting their teaching. And I drew on IPA, or interpretive phenomenological analysis, to analyze all the transcripts and highlight themes in the research. So now for some context regarding all of this. We'll go on a little global trip to give context for the motivation for the research. I'll firstly touch on some international developments, then some developments in Europe, then a little bit about the context in Ireland where this research was situated, and in particular, the classrooms relevant to this research. So Pennycook aptly describes how the mobile times that we live in have brought us mobile terms, and he calls it the super poly metro movement. So what he's talking about is terms that have been developed to describe how languages and cultures are meeting and influencing each other in a changed global linguistic landscape. And it's inevitable that this new linguistic landscape is reflected in our classrooms. In fact, there's such a growth in terms to describe this linguistic landscape in education, in sociology, and in linguistics that has been described as a panoply of lingualisms. A little bit, I think, like the game whack-a-mole. As soon as one term pops up, another term pops up to take its place. We've had languaging and polylanguaging and metrolingualism and cross-linguistic practice and plurilingualism and plurilanguaging and translanguaging. Definitely a panoply of lingualisms. These terms may all be used to describe slightly different settings or different contexts, but ultimately they all capture the notion of languages not being strictly separated from each other, like the colours in the balls of wool in this first picture here, but rather more intermingled and woven together, like the colours in the ball of wool in the second picture. It's natural that this would affect classrooms, and in classrooms as well, there has been a movement from the strict separation of languages to a more fluid and flexible approach, moving away from what Cummins describes as the monolingual principle in classrooms and that strict separation of languages to a more multilingual turn, where a more holistic linguistic repertoire is recognised. One of the more common terms to describe this fluid and flexible approach has been translanguaging. Now, interesting for us in Ireland, in our setting, translanguaging, the word first originated in Wales and was described as the planned and systematic use of two languages for teaching and learning inside the same lesson. Now, interesting to note that the words planned and systematic here. Translanguaging is also described as the process of making meaning, shaping experiences, understandings, and knowledge through the use of two languages. Like a lot of terms, though, translanguaging has been described by Singleton and Flynn as a pedagogical concept that went wandering. In other words, it probably drifted far from the original meaning. And instead of being just used to describe the planned and systematic use of two languages within a classroom, it started being widened and used to describe a more societal multilingualism, or more to describe the common practices of bilinguals who move to and fro between languages. So that can cause confusion sometimes for teachers when they're discussing their understandings of translanguaging, because the question is, what is their definition of translanguaging? Are they talking about the planned and systematic use of two languages in a classroom, or are they talking about a more fluid approach to describe a type of societal bilingualism or multilingualism? Now, this caution is urged by a lot of scholars in the use of translanguaging in immersion education and in the case of minority languages, because it is argued that this more flexible approach could undermine the goals of immersion programs and threaten the sustainability of the minority language. The main argument is that it's difficult enough for students in these settings to use the target language and that they're being bombarded with input in the majority language. So recommending a use of more non-target language could be detrimental to the language acquisition there. Why? Because language separation has always been seen as a core principle in immersion education. Translanguaging and immersion education are sometimes perceived to be incompatible. And in the Irish setting, anyway, it's widely accepted that teachers in Irish medium education should use Irish only in the classroom. But I have another however here, because that, as may be, we know that they're using the L1 anyway. So teachers, even though they feel that they shouldn't be doing this, they know that they're using English anyway. And that comes with a lot of tension. Tension in the practice, obviously, but there's also tension and complexity in teachers' attitudes and feelings regarding the use of the L1. And this was certainly something that came out of this research. One teacher said, we were saying that we feel that English is a kind of a bad guy. And there's a little picture of a bad guy there to illustrate, and that it's Irish versus English, like a battle. And it shouldn't be like that, you know. So there are a lot of tensions there. This tension between English as the bad guy, that it's Irish versus English, but also this sense inside that it shouldn't be like that. So that definitely is a type of tension there. Feelings that were uncovered amongst the teachers when they were asked about using English or English language resources, English language videos, English language texts in the classroom, they felt a lot of doubt. They felt guilt. They felt judgment. One teacher described that she felt, you know, sometimes that she was being watched. She described that there was a glass door on her classroom, and that sometimes when she was playing YouTube videos through English in the classroom, that she was surreptitiously casting an eye to the glass door to be sure that nobody was looking at her. Definitely feelings of anxiety, discomfort, feeling disloyal. And that was an interesting concept or an interesting feeling in the case of Irish language immersion, because the teachers, I think, felt a loyalty towards the principles of immersion education. And also by using English, sometimes they felt that they were being disloyal to the students because they had a keen sense of this vicious circle that they were functioning within, that the more English that they used, the less Irish the students were hearing, but sometimes they felt that they had to use the English in order to gain understanding of the subject. But they knew that they weren't probably doing, or they felt that they weren't doing the students any favors. So this sense of disloyalty to the students and disloyalty to the principles of immersion education. So very complex and I suppose negative and complex feelings there. Interestingly, I did a workshop with a larger group of teachers before Christmas, and we had a word cloud exercise. And the question was, how do you feel when you use English language resources in the classroom? And I've translated the words in the word cloud here to English, but the words are embarrassed, guilty, lazy, vulnerable, one positive one, effective, unsure, uncomfortable, disappointed, another positive one, realistic, under time pressure, unsure, and weak. So we can feel that we can see that these are quite strong feelings and emotions here. Add to this more challenges that teachers perceive to be particular to the immersion and minority language education setting. The teachers felt that they were grappling with a lack of suitable resources. And what I mean by that is that they felt that if you are a business teacher or an economics teacher or a geography teacher and you're teaching your subject through Irish, that very often they felt that there wasn't the same level of attractive, colourful graphics and videos and YouTubes and PowerPoints available to them through Irish, so that therefore it was easier to use English language resources. They also felt that they were spending a lot of time and energy creating their own resources through Irish, and that, you know, coupled with the demands of the job and the stresses of balancing all their teaching commitments, that it was getting harder and harder to swim against the tide of English language resources. Terminology was an issue for them. They sometimes felt that it was easier for the students to use terminology in English because it was more familiar to them, and that it was difficult to access resources that used the Irish language terminology naturally. And they felt that they were battling against a reduced student language competence, and that sometimes when students struggled with the Irish language resources, that it was easier to use and explain things in English. That said, they realized also that they were part within this vicious circle where the less the student understands in Irish, the more English the teacher is going to use, but the more English the teacher is going to use, the less Irish the student is going to hear, and that they weren't helping this vicious circle very often by using English. There was also an issue that they were aware of with teacher language competence, and we have a lot of research, I suppose, that describes that teachers aren't always comfortable themselves teaching their subjects through Irish, and that was an issue for some teachers. The other thing was that they felt that teaching the subject was the ultimate goal here, and that helping students reach what they described as this light bulb moment in subject understanding was a key goal, because at the end of the day, they were preparing them for state examinations, and that they felt that anything that would anything that would create a shortcut to understanding the subject was very important, and sometimes that English language resources hurried up the understanding of the concepts in the subject. And they also felt that there was unclear policy within the school as to the role of English, and there were clear policies in the use of Irish, but that English wasn't often mentioned anywhere in school policies. And they also felt that there was a lack of training in the area. And these workshops were the first time that they had ever been asked to explore their feelings towards the use of English in the classroom, because they'd never had that experience before at initial teacher education level or in continuous professional development. So that was interesting in itself. So as one of the teachers said, there has to be a middle ground here. There has to be middle ground somewhere between the use of English and the use of Irish, and to find maybe a peaceful harmony in between. Which leads us to the concept of sustainable translanguaging, coined by Sanoz and Gorter, which is a type of translanguaging that provides space and protection to the minority language, but that also harnesses some of the benefits of more than one language in the classroom. So my question, I suppose, to myself and in this research is, where could we find a way to provide a more sustainable translanguaging? Because teachers admit that they're using English anyway. So if they're using it anyway, how can we use it in some sort of way that's more sustainable? And it occurred to me that the answer might be in this concept of cross-linguistic mediation, as described in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages in 2001 and in the companion volume in 2020. So what is cross-linguistic mediation? Well, the mediator, according to the CEFR, is a social agent who creates bridges and helps to construct or convey meaning, sometimes within the same language, and sometimes from one language to another, which is cross-linguistic mediation. So again, I think this is better illustrated by a picture. I like to imagine the cross-linguistic mediator as somebody who's on one side of a bridge, and they're putting a meaning over the other side of the bridge to somebody who's trying to understand that thing. So what they're doing is they're processing something in their own head, and they have to understand that message first themselves. And then they're repackaging or reformulating or reprocessing that message and transferring it over and recreating it in a way that the other person will understand. So you can see how this differs from translation. This isn't a word-for-word translation. The message is getting recreated according to whoever is listening. So, for example, if I go on holiday to France with my elderly parents, and I see a sign on the beach, and the sign is describing all the rules and regulations of the beach, and my parents say to me, "Oh, what does that sign say?" I'm not going to translate the sign word for word for them from French to English or French to Irish. What I'm doing is I'm scanning that sign and I'm seeing, what's in there that's useful for them. So I might summarize it briefly and give them the information that they need in a way that they're going to understand. So I might say to them, you're not allowed to swim between 12 and 3, but I'm probably not going to give them the information that they can't be drinking alcohol on the beach during the day, because they're not going to do that anyway. So you can see how this is a key concept for a teacher, because they're constantly reformulating ideas and language in a way that the other person is going to understand. An example for the classroom is, imagine a geography teacher who's trying to teach the concepts of meanders and oxbow lakes to a group of students. And the class is going to be in Irish. But that teacher finds an English language YouTube video that describes with images and with video very well the process of meanders and oxbow lakes. So the teacher is playing that video for the students and asking them to do some worksheets afterwards through Irish. Now, this is a common enough practice in these types of settings. But what the teachers very often said they didn't realize is how difficult this is linguistically to do, because the students are being asked to process a text in language A, which is English. So they're understanding and processing the information in English, but yet they had to do the task in Irish. So they're having to recreate the input text through Irish. But even though the teacher said after the training that they do this often, they hadn't realized what they were asking the students to do. When they understood that this was a cross-linguistic mediation task, they were a lot more aware of what the demands on the students were. So what's happening here is a classic example of a cross-linguistic mediation task. The input is in one language, the video text is in English, and the output is in Irish. But the missing step very often in the classrooms is the bit in the middle, the bit that brings you across the bridge from input to output. The scaffolding tasks that have to happen in the middle to enable the student to go from the input to the output. And that was the main focus of these workshops, is to help students or help teachers realize, number one, that they were doing cross-linguistic mediation tasks. And once that realization was there, to think of language tasks that would enable the students to go from input to output, from one language to the other. So when you approach the English language videos and the English language input and the Irish language output in this way, you can see that the emphasis is on the product. The emphasis is on the task. And in cross-linguistic mediation, the emphasis is on the output. Therefore, the emphasis is on the target language. The emphasis is on Irish. And through this emphasis on the target language, there is a certain sustainability here, that when the teachers are looking at it in this way, that they can see, oh, we now need to focus on the production in Irish. And by focusing on the production in Irish as the main feature of the lesson, this can provide a certain level of sustainability for the Irish language by putting more emphasis on it. So did the teachers, what did they think about this? They described in the first interviews feeling guilty and feeling doubtful, feeling anxious, and feeling judgment when using English. They also interestingly described their practice as an ad hoc approach. They felt that they were just throwing up English language resources without planning for them, without thinking about them, and without thinking in any way of what the output is, what is the aim of this English language resource. And they also described using English resources just as fillers, just something to do in the classroom when they were grappling with the lack of resources. After the workshops, they described feeling more confident, more comfortable using English language resources, less guilty and less anxious. And they described themselves in their own words, their practice as more conscious now, that they were more conscious of the Irish. They described being more planned in their approach. They described being a lot more structured, that they were now planning for the use of Irish in these after using these videos, as opposed to only thinking about the English input. One teacher described it as more nutritious. She felt that by putting the emphasis on the Irish language output, that she was being more nutritious for Irish. And they were also more cautious, and they had more reflection on, do I actually need to use this English language resource, or am I just using it as a filler because I don't have anything else? One teacher said the same old isn't working anymore. Immersion is fine on paper, but realistically, nearly every teacher I know uses English resources. And now, instead of just using them and saying to yourself, oh, I shouldn't be doing this, why don't we use them in a constructive way? And not to be fearful or embarrassed to use them, but use them in a planned way, like we did in this workshop. Another teacher nicely described thinking how she could use English as a support or a leg up for Irish, or for the subject being taught through Irish. So I quite liked that image of it being just used as a leg up or a support for Irish. Another teacher said, this isn't so fragmented. It's a way that you know you're doing something that could be kind of nutritious or could be kind of fruitful, so that they're walking out of the class and they know that they've done a few tasks between the sandwiching of the English, that it's not just an English-Irish empty sandwich in between. By focusing on scaffolding tasks, they were providing, I suppose, nearly a filler for the sandwich between the Irish and English. When you're using English resources, it's almost like, how can they be as nutritious for Irish as if you're using them for English? And I guess the template, because we used a template in the workshop, does kind of lay out what will be nutritious. How are we actually using English to use as much Irish as possible? So what were the reflections then? What were teachers focusing on in this workshop? First of all, when thinking about your L1 text, the video through English, think, why is this needed? Is it needed at all? So by doing that, they were able to reflect on what was good in this. Was it good for the concept? Was it good diagrammatically? Was it good because it was fun? Was it good because it was attractive to teenagers? What's useful about it? So once they were able to identify that, they were able to design much more fruitful tasks. And what role will it play? This was also an interesting one, because teachers felt, by reflecting on this, that sometimes they felt they were using the English language resource at the wrong time in the classroom, that they were now more inclined to use it as an input for the concept at the start of the class, rather than using it as a summary at the end of the class. Because by using it as a summary, they felt they were undoing the work that they had done with the Irish in the classroom, so that they were more conscious of what place this video or text had in the class plan. They did a lot of reflection on the L2 task, on the output, and they realised how important it was to be clear on the output that is required. So are they watching this video in order to provide a summary themselves? Are they doing it to do a worksheet? Are they doing it to be able to design a poster on the formation of a lake? Are they doing it to answer an exam question? And then once the output has been clearly described, then start building the bridge. What is the vocabulary, the Irish language vocabulary the student needs to do the task? What grammar structures do they need? And what relevant activities does the teacher need to design in order to give the student the vocabulary and the grammar in order to be able to do the Irish language task? So they came up with ideas on vocabulary preparation exercises that were always very useful to help the students do the Irish language output. They could have provided glossaries. They got students to prepare their own glossaries, use an online dictionary, making drafts and improving drafts using dictionaries and glossaries, closed tests using key vocabulary from the lesson, and highlighting and learning language structures that are needed to complete the tasks. So these are just examples of some of the bridging tasks that were effective to go from English language input to Irish language output. What did the teachers themselves feel was needed going forward? They definitely felt there was a need for training, as this is the first time that they'd ever had the opportunity to participate in anything like this. They felt there was a need of awareness of translanguaging and cross-linguistic mediation, both in the management setting, in schools, amongst other teachers, also within the inspectorate and within teacher training bodies. So they said that they'd love to see more CPD on this and more awareness throughout all the school settings, especially in management. They also felt that there was a need for a whole school approach on this as well, as opposed to isolated teachers being aware of this. What they felt themselves is very helpful is when they're using an English language video and teaching a lesson through Irish based in it, it was really helpful to visualize this as a cross-linguistic task and to plan accordingly. So by shifting their focus and actually seeing this as a language thing and seeing it as a linguistic task, they were a lot more focused and a lot more nutritious, I suppose, in their approach to the English. And they felt that the scaffolding tasks, that they'd love to see some more training on how to design them and more reflection on how to design effective scaffolding tasks to bridge between the languages. So therefore, in summary, there possibly is a way, I think, based on this research, for the structure of a cross-linguistic mediation task and more awareness and training on it to be used as a more sustainable way to use translanguaging in immersion and CLIL settings, instead of the approach that the teachers described as just throwing up English language resources without thinking of them, and a way that they described as an empty sandwich. So instead of dealing with the empty sandwich, that we can move forward to a more nutritious approach. And that's it. And thank you very much for listening.
Well, Eileen, thank you. Thank you once again for this very interesting talk and for sharing these experiences with us. Yeah, I mean, challenging because you were talking about something new in your context with teachers who, you know, sometimes are a bit reluctant to change practices. So, yeah, thank you very much. Well, let's wait to see if we get any questions or comments from the audience. But in the meantime, let me, thank you for the presentation. It's wonderful to see how we can work towards making different languages in the in a context be allies instead of enemies, as you said. That vision of, you know, languages as being opposed entities, instead of, you know, making the most out of all the languages that students use and know. I have a question myself. So when all these cross-linguistic mediation activities that teachers developed, were they group work activities or individual activities, or a combination of both, maybe?
Were they group work for the students?
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. It depended, I think, on the setting and the subject and the type of task. So I think the vocabulary ones were, you know, maybe pair work, you know, work together, match the columns, fill the blanks, find the words. And sometimes they were group work. For example, there was one task where I think it was on rivers in geography, and the goal was that the students would design a poster in groups to describe in Irish the formation of a river and the different stages of the river. So therefore the students would work together as a group, and that was the final task. But to reach that task, they would have had maybe an individual task, and then maybe pair work on the vocabulary, and then work together then to draw and design the poster. So different stages. It depended on what stage of the process they were at.
Great. Yeah. So the facilitating tasks, mostly individual pair work, and then the final mediation tasks themselves were mostly in group work. And do teachers also provide with linguistic resources to carry out that cooperative work in Irish? Or maybe they don't need to, because the students, when they do these group tasks, do they usually use Irish,
Yes.
while managing their interaction
Yes.
and everything? Okay.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. The school language would be through Irish, and students
Mhm.
are encouraged to use Irish all of the time. So
Mhm.
it was interesting as well. We were able to touch on the concept of, teacher translanguaging versus pupil translanguaging in the workshop. And even though teachers hadn't been aware of the distinction between the types, without being aware of it, it was very obvious that they were aware, because while they were saying they'd be happy as teachers to use English language resources in the classroom, they said that they would never be happy for students to use English amongst themselves in the classroom.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
So that was another protection and sustainability being provided for the minority language, even though they didn't realize it. And one teacher said, "Oh, I didn't actually ever realize that I would be very against the students using
Mhm.
English, but I'm okay with me using English just to explain something quickly to them." But they would never allow the students to use English in the classroom. Or if they heard English in the corridors or in
Mhm.
the schoolyard, they would be ready to correct the students and possibly use sanctions or whatever the school policy would be, but from their own point of view. So the translanguaging that they were using was fully a teacher-focused translanguaging as
Mhm.
opposed to pupil translanguaging.
Mhm. And were they more flexible about students using English at some point during group work, or?
They, I think they're quite conscious that English is the majority language and the more natural language for the students. But depending on the age they are as well, I think in the more senior years they're able to do all their business through Irish in the classroom. The junior
Mhm.
years need a little bit more scaffolding. So I think the leeway that they are given depends on the age that they're at.
Okay.
Yeah, but usually the students would be expected to be able to function through Irish,
Mhm. Mhm.
yeah, socially, and in order to perform group tasks. But the issue would lie when introducing new concepts in subjects where they don't have the vocabulary yet.
Mhm.
Like for example, in one of the business videos, it was about the concept of logos, types of logos, function of logos,
Mhm.
describing logos. So again, this vocabulary would possibly be new to the students. So
Mhm.
they might have the language for facilitating group tasks, but they wouldn't have the vocabulary to talk about the subject. So these tasks are about giving them those words without depending on just the English language video to
Mhm.
give them the concept.
Great.
Mhm.
Yeah. And then the majority language then comes in handy as a resource
Yeah.
for, yeah, to foster the use of the other language, in this case Irish. Yeah, great. Okay, and another question I have for you, related to the tasks. Did the teachers in the workshops see any challenges or negatives in using these tasks? You mentioned, I think, some of them, but maybe you would like to expand on that.
Yeah, they did see some challenges. One of the challenges was an interesting one in that they felt that to do the cross-linguistic mediation tasks effectively, you have to really understand the language yourself and see opportunities within it. So, for example, with the one of the business tasks, there was language in it that's quite complex in Irish, where it's like nicer, more beautiful, bigger, that structure. And you'd have to be able to identify it, know that they need it to do the task, and be able to design nice activities to help the students use that. But they felt that that was all dependent on the teacher themselves being extremely comfortable with the structure of the Irish language. And while they might have some degree of fluency, they mightn't always be language teachers. So the issue of, every CLIL teacher is a language teacher, that was more and more necessary for the use of these cross-linguistic mediation tasks. So if a teacher themselves wasn't comfortable, 100% comfortable using Irish, then it could be very difficult for them to do this. But that they also felt that it was a little bit supportive for the teachers who didn't have 100% comfort in Irish, because it enabled them to sit down and work on the vocabulary and the structures themselves before doing the task. So they felt that that could be an issue. And also the other issue were, management being on board, and also the inspectorate, that they felt that sometimes when the inspectorate come by for inspections, that they would be very against using any English language resources, so that they wouldn't want to be seen to be doing that in front of the inspectorate. So that there were some complications and challenges there, but overall they were very, very positive about the training.
Okay, so I see this is a bottom-up initiative, right? So hopefully we'll get up to, high, instances, in the hierarchy for them to be aware of, the potential of these practices, right?
Yeah. They also highlighted very much the need for research and comprehensive research, because the slight risk, I suppose, maybe, is that teachers could then be using this as an excuse to validate or, give themselves a license or a pass to use English in the classroom whenever they want, because this research says that it's okay to do so. So it was important that the workshop was contextualized, and they got opportunities to talk about the disadvantages as well. But overall, the teachers were so conscious of the need to support Irish, and unknown to themselves, were putting so many strategies in place through their teaching to be sure that Irish was safeguarded and that the emphasis was on Irish. So they really welcomed a strategy that would enable that further, I suppose. So they just saw possibilities and positivity in it.
Now, also, I guess that one of the main arguments for this is that, these practices, moving from English into Irish, using English, inputting English to produce something Irish, is something that students will face in their future, right? When they go to, their jobs, and they will have to do that at some point. So why not help them, become aware of what they need to do to do that successfully, right?
Yes, exactly. And the teachers spoke about that they felt that, even though they hadn't themselves come across the notion of the Council of Europe social agent, that they felt that they were bridging, that they were building bridges between the home language of the student and the school language. So they were realizing that if the student comes across vocabulary in business or accountancy, that they were likely to meet that through English. When they go to the bank or the credit union. So they were subconsciously, I suppose, always bridging that gap for them and showing them very relevant and realistic resources, while also helping them learn the concepts or describe or articulate their learning through Irish.
Yeah, sure. Okay, and you touched upon a bit about the managerial perspective. What about the school management? Is a whole school approach important, do you think? Between teachers, for example, Irish teachers helping content teachers, the board of school helping mediate between teachers and inspectors from
Yeah.
administration. So what do you think?
Oh, I think that, well, the teachers felt as well that this was really important. They felt that it would be great to be able to share resources, that, in the larger schools, they'd have subject departments, and that each teacher within the department would have an opportunity to share resources with the other teachers, and that also that the school management would be on board also with this and receive training and realise that this is being done for the good of Irish, as opposed to just being done because the teacher can't find anything better to do, only just play a YouTube video through English. So that the positivity and the functionality of this would be clear to the management, and also would be probably important that the teacher training body would also be aware and run training on this, so that it would not be just an outlier, but something that all teachers would be aware of, because their point was that they were doing this anyway. So if they're going to be doing it anyway, why not do it in a way that's more structured, and a way that makes them feel less guilty, and a way that puts much more emphasis on Irish?
Mm-hmm. Okay, sure, yeah. It's a question of making the most out of what we have and what we actually do, right? Instead
Yeah,
of seen as the elephant in the room, as you said in the beginning.
yeah,
uh,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Well, and maybe maybe a last question, and I'm sorry about bringing up AI to the discussion, because now if you don't say anything about AI, it seems like we're not updating the topic. So what do you think is the role of AI all this? Do you think it can also be a tool for learners to use Irish more even within these cross-linguistic practices? Or do you think it can hinder the potential of cross-linguistic practices? I know it's a big question, just to
Mm.
know your thoughts about on this.
I'm sure like everything with AI, it probably depends on what use and for who and where. And I'm sure it could be used as a force for good and positively, and also it could be used quite negatively as well, because we're not, the Irish language and AI is getting there, but it's still not.
Mhm.
I think it's still relatively easy for teachers to know when a student has used AI in Irish, because it's not, as good in Irish as it is in English, obviously.
Mhm.
But I could certainly see it as a planning tool for teachers, and being useful in that kind of way. But I think it's early days maybe yet, but students definitely are using it for Irish. Um, but I think for subject teaching, I'm still unclear as to,
Mhm.
what
Yeah.
are the forces for good that we could harness there.
Mhm. Okay, yeah, and also, it's very interesting, the teacher's perspective that you mentioned. Maybe they can use it as a kickoff, tool to get ideas on how to start
Mm,
working in these facilitating
mm,
cross-linguistic mediation activities. Even though they will have to, of course, judge those ideas and those
mm.
techniques. But sometimes teachers may be a bit lost about how do I go about language here, how do I
Yeah.
create a language-based focused activity for my
Mhm.
students, because I'm a teacher of geography. So
Mhm.
then the AI can give them a starting point, a springboard for them to work on, and then
Mm.
develop good ideas. Because of course we all know that AI can give you ideas, but then you will have to critically judge that output. You cannot use
Mm.
it as you know.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's it. It's critically judging the output, and I suppose one of the key issues here in these tasks is that the teachers would identify the relevant language
Mhm.
structures
Mhm.
in the task that the students have to do. So I'm not sure that that's something we're at yet with AI in Irish. But what you mentioned there earlier about the subject or the language teachers getting involved in helping with these tasks, I think would be key, because one of the teachers in the research was both a language teacher, she was an Irish language teacher, and a business teacher. So she would have been so skilled, I suppose, maybe at spotting what language structures were necessary to complete the task in the subject. But to be able to help other teachers do that across all subjects, it would probably need the input of language teachers. So that is definitely an interesting point.
A very good, a good opportunity for cooperation among teachers. Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I think we can come to an end now. Once again, well, thank you, Eileen. Thank you for the presentation. It's been very, very interesting. And well, thank everyone also for attending and watching this webinar. And I invite you to join us in our next webinar of this series. The last one is in June for this academic year, and then we will resume in October. So yeah, thank you, Eileen, once again.
Thank you very much.
And bye to everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.